All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our online lecture this week. Recall we're not going to be in the classroom this week, so we've got two topics that we should be able to cover here sort of at a distance quite easily. We're going to be doing ethics, and then we're going to be doing computational tools. I should go ahead and mention a couple things before we get started. First off, on logistics, I plan to upload a quiz maybe tonight or maybe really early tomorrow if I get time. I'll try and have that closed, at our regular Wednesday at 4 p.m. timeline. If I'm not able to, and if I'm a little late, I'll make sure that you all have more time on that. I just wanted to throw that out there. A couple of other things. I'm actually going to do this in two parts. There's actually going to be two separate videos, one on ethics and one on computer science or computational tools. And the reason for that, and this is sort of my final announcement, and I'll get right into it, is because I'm doing the ethics review very differently than I have done not only in the past, but actually quite differently from all of the other ethics or all of the other FE review videos, because I think that ethics is a unique topic. So instead of doing just practice problems, I'm actually not doing any practice problems in the review, and instead I'm just going to cover some basics regarding the code and some basics and some more of, I guess, ethical issues that engineers face. And if you understand that, I think that you'll understand how to tackle the vast majority of questions that you would deal with on the exam. And so I think from a review standpoint, this is going to be a much more efficient use of our time, if you will. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive right into ethics. So let me pull this up. Okay. All right, so ethics, first off, is not a very big topic on the exam, anywhere between 4 to 6 questions, but it can cover a variety of different issues. And one of the things about ethics is I really find it to be, I'd say, the most unique section on the exam, because there's no computations involved at all. There's no equations to solve. There's no values to plug and chug. There's no units to figure out. It's entirely different. And so as a result, I was thinking that our review should be just as different. Now, as for the list of topics that it covers, there's the codes of ethics, professional liability, sustainability, professional skills, so on and so forth. It really sort of boils down to your understanding of your responsibilities as an engineer. Now, I want to briefly review the NCES code and model law just so that you're aware. So let me pull this up. So this is the FE reference handbook, and it's actually early in the handbook. It starts off, there's units and conversion factors and things like that. And then the ethics code is actually quite early in the manual. Now, it goes through and describes what some general provisions on the codes of ethics. And then if you look, it's actually somewhat long. It's, I think like 4 or 5 pages. And it covers, or actually more than that, and it covers quite a bit of different areas on intellectual property, trademarks, on surveying, and this, that, and the other. And it's a lot to take in, and it's also a lot, I guess the best way to describe it is, given an ethical situation for which you need to answer a question, it could sometimes feel like I don't know where to look and I don't know where to begin. One of the things you will find with the ethical questions that you get on the FE exam is that there is a clearly defined answer. You're not really asked what I call gray questions on the exam. They might seem gray when you first read it, but there is a clearly defined answer, and that answer does tend to refer to one of these provisions. But because there's so much here and there's so much to take in, what I've decided to do is sort of boil that down into what I think are the most critical provisions that I think you need to understand, and sort of, I guess, some of the common pitfalls and the common ethical challenges that engineers face. So let me get right into that with this presentation. It's somewhat short, but I do want to discuss some of these issues in detail. So first off, let's talk about overall ethical priorities and where ethical challenges come from, and where some of the questions that you're going to get on the exam and common ethical issues that engineers face. It always happens when one ethical responsibility or concern conflicts with another. So just to frame that in a very simple, easy to understand challenge, let's say you had to make a decision between using a cheaper part or a cheaper beam or a less expensive product, but using that product or implementing that part could cause an issue with public safety. You know, if I have an engine and I put a crappy gear in it, pardon the term, but I put a bad gear in it and the engine blows up and hurts somebody. Okay, that's an ethical challenge. So what do I do? Do I use the cheaper part and save some money, or do I use the expensive part and ensure that the public safety is maintained? Well, that's pretty easy. I think that's a pretty straightforward. Use the gear that's safe, even if it means it's more money, because the safety of the public is your primary concern. That's easy. Well, that's an easy one. Sometimes on the FE you might get one that's not so easy. So where do you rank your priorities? Well, so here on this slide I have what the engineer's priorities are in order of, what's the most important to what's the least important. So the first off, what's most important is society and the public. And generally what I'm talking about there is their safety. You cannot design anything that is unsafe or that poses a risk to the public's welfare. It's your primary concern, and right off the bat, if you're ever having a question on the FE and there is a choice that would cause there is an option that would lead to a detriment of the public safety, it's the wrong answer, just right off the bat. Next comes the law. Engineers must follow the law. And then next comes the profession, then the client and your firm. And so the client and the firm, things like that relationship can get is where a lot of potential ethical issues can arise, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. Other involved engineers, other involved parties, and then finally yourself. And that's sort of another point with ethical concerns, is that your first primary concern is the general public's welfare and safety. The last concern is yourself. Your priorities are last on this list. But excuse me. What we're going to do is, I think that's pretty easy to understand. However, what I think is a little more challenging, I would say, is some of these topics in the middle. So let me go to this next slide, and I want to take some of these issues and one by one boil them down. So first off, I have some points regarding your clients and your potential employers, and these are some high-level bullet points I think you need to keep in mind. First off, do not perform work for which you are not qualified. Okay, and there are a number of potential questions you'll get on the FE where it's leading to that topic. You will never see me design a circuit. I am a bridge engineer. I wouldn't know the first thing about it. So I know that that is not within my technical area, and I'm not doing it. Recognize your limitations. There's nothing wrong with that. You have a given skill set. That skill set is your area. Always protect the interests of the client. You are working for the client, so their interests should be your primary concern, unless the client asks you to do something that is unethical, in which case you can't do that. You're working for a client, and let's say they're an industrial manufacturer. They produce some sort of industrial client, and they ask you to falsify a water quality report so that they won't get fined. Yeah, you can't do that. Okay. Recognize this next bullet point, I think can lead to a lot of pretty straightforward answers on the exam. Recognize that any information that is to be considered confidential is not your property. It is the property of the client. The client owns that information. So whenever issues of confidentiality arise, if you keep that in your mind, I think that a lot of potential challenges can be met by just recognizing that primary concern. Avoiding conflicts of interest. So I'm a bridge engineer, so I'll give you a bridge engineering example. Let's say that there is a company that creates a new type of reinforcement for reinforced concrete using some sort of advanced polymer. And I think that this is going to revolutionize the market, so much so that I personally invest some of my funds in a company manufacturing this stuff. And then a project comes along where I need to design a bridge, and I use that reinforcement. Even if it might be the best product on the market, even if I believe that, I have a financial interest in using it, because the more that product's used, the more potential money I could make. So there are some very significant challenges there. Make sure that you're informing your client of any relationships, investments, anything like that could influence your decisions, because otherwise you would be misleading your client, and so and you need to keep that relationship paramount. And so another way of thinking about it is that your sole source of income or compensation or what have you from a particular job should be whatever fee your client is paying you, and that's it. So if you keep that in mind, I think that again, a number of those issues on the FE will be resolved. Be clear in your work product. Engineers are human beings. If we weren't, we wouldn't need to have this discussion, and all of this would go away. Because you're a human being, you can make errors. It is possible. Openly and freely admit those errors to your public. Or to your client. Do not conceal that. That will cause very significant issues down the line. Okay, regarding your fellow engineer, ethical issues that can arise regarding your peers. Okay, never insult the reputation of a fellow engineer. There are a number of project-specific pieces of information that you might not be privy to, and unless you're aware, this could cause some issues. And I'll give you an example, and again, I apologize if I point too much to the bridge engineering world, but it's what I know. For example, let's say that I'm looking at a bridge design and I see their beam design, and I do the math, and I realize that beam looks a little over-designed. And I might think to myself, well, I might start to get a little critical of that engineer, but there might be a host of other issues that I wasn't aware of that caused that engineer to make that decision. Maybe there were sourcing issues. Maybe there was by picking that beam, the lead time was decreased substantially, and it ultimately decreased labor costs and decreased the cost of the project. Decisions like that happen in bridge engineering all the time, and in the end lead to a more economic product that doesn't compromise safety at all. But then again, all I'm doing is looking at the plans, and here I go wanting to make sort of these criticisms of the engineer without understanding all the facts. Now, to be clear, if you have reviewed a design or reviewed something that you believe is unethical, that is going to lead to a challenge to public safety, if you believe that you discovered illegal behavior, well, of course, you need to report that. But this is one of the reasons that we have this ethical provision, because without having all the facts, you aren't aware of what's going on. Engineers should not use unfair advantages, and so one very common topic on the FE exam that might pop up is the idea of moonlighting. So what do I mean by moonlighting? Well, let's say you are a salaried engineer, and you work a full-time job and are paid on salary, and then at night you decide, well, or in your spare time you decide, well, I'll do some consulting on the side, and that's a gray area. And honestly, many engineers do that. The only really where the ethical issue comes from is when you're engaging in behavior that puts you in an unfair advantage. In other words, you're doing work that other engineers and other peers in your field couldn't do. They couldn't take those advantages. They couldn't take those advantages. That's where the ethical issues arise. So moonlighting is something that you would definitely want to avoid. And if there are allusions to moonlighting on FE exam problems, it will generally be regarded as an unethical practice. Now, here's another thing about regarding your peer engineers. Engineers should generally promote free distribution of information. We want to improve the profession, and so the way that we do that is when we discover something or design something, and as long as we're not violating confidentiality issues and things like that, that information should be widely available to the public. For example, research and understanding on a given phenomenon in engineering, engineers should want to make that available if it's going to improve the profession. Now, the limit to that is when those issues start to bump in the face of client confidentiality or legal issues or things like that. I'll give you an example that's actually not bridge related. Let's look at the building design sphere. One of the more complex areas in building design is to design for seismicity or earthquakes. And it's a very complex field in structural engineering, and as a result, there are many different proprietary systems that are out there in order to arrest seismicity. So the general idea, you have a building, you excite that building with an earthquake, the building wants to displace laterally, and it will undergo large deflections and will experience a large amount of forces. And so as long as the building remains upright and people can get out safely, that's one of the primary focuses or goals of seismic design. And so there's all sorts of proprietary bracing elements and bracing systems and things like that out there that are available for engineers to use. Now, there are plenty of companies and fabricators and things like that that are developing systems, and there are some elements to those systems that are proprietary. Everything else, though, about those systems is made available to the engineering community. For example, if you're a company and you've designed a new type of brace that you can install in steel frames that has so-and-so or has such, improved performance under earthquakes, well, you're going to want to tell the engineering community all about its performance, make sure they understand the hysteresis behavior, that they know what R values would be applied, and so on and so forth. And the reason is because engineers need to know that in order to be able to implement it. That doesn't mean that you need to explain every single little aspect of how that is fabricated. There are plenty of elements like buckling restrained braces where as long as the engineer understands the predicted behavior, they can make that decision, but the proprietary aspects can still be protected. So just something to keep in mind. Some other issues that can arise, just not only just with ethical issues, but just things that you can see on the FE exam. First off, again, like I said, and this is a dead giveaway, if you ever are asked a question on the exam where a choice would compromise public safety, it's the wrong answer, okay? Always consider the safety, health, and welfare of the public as paramount. If there are ever any, observations that you make where an engineer has compromised public safety, you should notify the authorities. That practice is called whistleblowing. Ironically, that term's floating around the news right now. But in regards to engineering, what I'm saying is when you observe a practice that could put people in danger and you report that to the authorities in the engineering sphere, that's what I mean by whistleblowing. And whistleblowing, to be clear, is fine if you're doing it to ensure that the public safety is maintained. It's actually, you have to do it. don't accept or solicit gifts from a supplier prior to a job. You're an engineer. Some beam supplier slips you tickets to the Super Bowl so that you'll use their beams. Yeah, that's unethical to take that. So that's a pretty common type of question that you would get on the exam. Be honest in your public statements. If you're ever making statements, be completely honest. Make sure all the facts are made aware of. That's fairly important. And another thing, stay current in your technical proficiency. This is it's something that I've even personally seen happen and kind of bugs me a bit. You go to a conference and there are engineers that are attending presentations so that they can collect their PDHs for licensure to renew their professional engineer's license, and they're clearly not paying attention. They go in to the room, sign in, and leave, and then come back later and pick up their certificate. That happens quite regularly, and that's not really doing you or the public any good. Being current and being up to date in the practice of engineering does you good, does your client good, and does the engineering community good, as well as the public. So make sure that you stay current in your field. Here are some what I would call ethical challenges. We might be straying a bit beyond what is right for content for the FE exam. However, I can't help but mention some of these points because I think it might lead to a more fundamental understanding of ethics on your part. Some of these issues, we are starting to venture into gray territory. What is right versus what is wrong. Everything I've been talking about before is pretty cut and dried. It's pretty yin and yang, either one choice or the other. We're starting to get into gray territory here. And so maybe, if you start doing some research and looking into some of these ethical issues, you'll start to gain a more refined understanding of engineering ethics. For example, there are some very significant ethical issues associated with competitive bidding. What I mean by that is, let's say I'm an engineer and you're an engineer, and we're both bidding on the same job. Well, that process, by its very nature, forces you and I to try and produce the lowest bid possible. Well, by that nature, that process can lead to you and I potentially wanting to cut corners. And this has been litigated upon. It's even gone all the way to the Supreme Court on issues like this. And the way that the Supreme Court ruled, and there's reasons why competitive bidding really isn't mentioned in many codes of ethics, is that the Supreme Court, I guess the best way of putting it is, they're not requiring competitive bidding. They're basically forbidding a prohibition against it. Like, they're not encouraging it. They're saying you can't disallow it. And so competitive bidding happens. Like, there's no way around it. It does happen. But there's some ethical issues there because there's only so far that you can take that process, and then you start compromising your profession and compromising safety and so on and so forth. And then you start to get into ethical issues like environmental protection and sustainability. What responsibility do you have to the client versus the public versus the environment? What about when you're designing something in the interest of national security versus personal privacy? I'd say one of the questions I always ask students, and I always get very, very polarizing answers, is it ethical for an engineer to design a gun, to design a weapon? You're acting on behalf of your client, but then again, you may be designing an instrument that will be used to potentially kill somebody. And so if your interest is to maintain the safety, health, and welfare of the public, and yet you're designing an instrument of potential death, is that ethical? And so it really, it's almost like that question in and of itself could cause any potential student to start pouring through codes of ethics and and articles to try and understand it. And by doing that, you'll gain a much more deep understanding of engineering ethics than by just reviewing a few problems on the FE exam. And so I really think that there's some ripe area of study there. Another potential ethical challenge, and I'll sort of close with this, is the issues with outsourcing work. Sometimes it's called offshoring. You know, instead of designing within your organization or within your firm, or a simple way of thinking about it, even though it's not really, from an engineering perspective, I'm not really talking about outside the country, but it's easy to discuss it in this fashion. Instead of using design services in the United States, maybe you just outsource that work to a firm in another country. And you do that because it will save you money and save you resources. Well, again, there are ethical issues with that, not even so much from a public safety and welfare standpoint. I think that's an easy argument to make, to say, well, you know, you can't outsource something to save money if it's going to compromise public safety. I think that's easy. What's more difficult is when you start doing that, are you outsourcing the responsibility as well? You making that decision to outsource that work, who's responsible if things go wrong? Is it you, or is it the outsourced client if they're outside your sphere? You know, and the out of the country analogy works quite well, because they might even be outside the laws of your given region, of your given area. So there are some very significant challenges here. In this one slide, you can take any one of these bullet points, and by researching it, you'd be studying this concept, in my opinion, far better than you would by just doing some ethics problems. And I think with this topic, that's really where the pitfall can come from a studying perspective, because it's not like math or chemistry or physics where you learn by doing problems. The more that you do, the better you get at them. With ethics, sometimes the problems are so disparate that each problem is a case-by-case basis, and there's no real learning involved. And so I think the learning comes from taking a complex ethical issue and researching it and studying it and trying to form your opinion. And by doing that, you'll be reviewing these codes. And hopefully you all do that. I will post a quiz online with some ethical questions just to give you that experience. But I do think that you should pour into this a little bit, because there's some really interesting potential avenues to look into. That's all I have for this lecture. I'll be posting a lecture later on looking at computational tools. That's all I have. You all have a good evening.